Bombers were built to destroy armies. That was the theory. But in the Second World War, those bombers crossed front lines without slowing down. They did not circle trenches. They did not wait for divisions to assemble. They flew onward, toward cities, toward places where no formations stood in rows, where factories ran night shifts, where rail lines converged, where lights were turned off not to save electricity, but to survive the dark. This was not an accident, and it was not a loss of control. It was a calculated shift in how war was fought. Somewhere between the limits of technology and the demands of industrial conflict, the battlefield moved. To understand why cities were targeted, we have to step back to a time when air power promised to change war, but first revealed what it could not do. The city prepares long before the first aircraft arrive. Streetlights are switched off one by one. Curtains are drawn tight. Windows are covered. Entire neighborhoods fade into darkness, not because the power has failed, but because light itself has become dangerous. Then the sirens begin. They do not signal the approach of soldiers. They warn of something higher, unseen, already crossing borders. Searchlights snap on and cut through the sky, their beams intersecting and drifting, searching for shapes hidden by cloud. Anti-aircraft guns stand ready, aimed upward into empty darkness, waiting for sound before sight. On the ground, there is no front line. There are streets, homes stacked close together, factories still warm from the day's work. Above the cloud layer, bomber formations move steadily forward. Crews sit shoulder to shoulder in narrow fuselages, surrounded by instrument panels glowing softly in the dark. Headings are checked. Altitude is confirmed. Bomb bays open while the target remains invisible below. Navigation is done by timing, by radio signals, by landmarks that may or may not still exist. When bombs fall, there is no single point of impact. They land across rail yards, industrial districts, residential blocks. Shockwaves travel farther than intended. Fires spread beyond their initial targets. Smoke begins to erase the city's outline from the air. For those below, the experience is fragmented. Some hear explosions blocks away. Others feel walls shake before sound arrives. Many never see the aircraft at all. What becomes clear, even on the first night, is that this is not a battle in the traditional sense. No ground is taken. No enemy units surrender. No lines advance. Yet something fundamental has shifted. The war has entered the city itself. Factories that once felt distant from the front are now directly exposed. Rail lines that carried troops and fuel are no longer abstract targets on maps, but physical spaces under attack. Civilian life, already shaped by rationing and mobilization, is now inseparable from combat. This was the moment many understood that the war was no longer something happening elsewhere, it was overhead. And once the war moved into the night sky above cities, there would be no clear way to push it back to the front alone. When military planners first imagined the role of strategic bombers, their purpose seemed clear. Aircraft would find enemy armies. They would strike concentrations of troops, vehicles, and supply columns. They would weaken offensives before ground forces ever made contact. Air power, in theory, would shorten battles by breaking them before they fully formed. This idea was rooted in experience from earlier wars, where massed formations decided outcomes. If armies could be located and hit from above, bombers could become a decisive arm, flying artillery with reach no ground weapon possessed. Early planning documents reflected this belief. Enemy troop movements were marked on maps. Assembly areas were identified as targets. Railheads feeding frontline units were prioritized for immediate attack. The expectation was that bombing would directly influence battles in progress. But almost immediately, practice diverged from theory. Armies did not behave the way maps suggested they would. They rarely remained in large visible formations for long. Units learned to disperse the moment aircraft were reported. Columns broke apart, vehicles hid beneath trees, and movement shifted to night hours whenever possible. Even when intelligence reported troop concentrations, timing was unreliable. By the time aircraft arrived, the target often no longer existed. Pilots returned claiming strikes on enemy forces. Ground commanders reported little change. The gap between expectation and reality widened with each mission. Air power was powerful, but blunt. It could devastate fixed positions. It could disrupt known locations, but it struggled to engage forces that could move, hide, and adapt faster than aircraft could respond. What had been envisioned as a precision instrument against armies was becoming something else entirely. And as results failed to match early hopes, planners were forced to confront a difficult question. If bombers could not reliably destroy armies in the field, where could their power actually matter? In theory, finding an army should have been simple. Thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, columns stretching across roads and open ground. In reality, armies were some of the hardest targets air power ever faced. They moved constantly. Units advanced, halted, dispersed, and reassembled, often several times a day. Columns learned to break apart the moment aircraft were reported. Vehicles were parked beneath trees, beside buildings, or under camouflage nets designed to distort their outlines from above. What could be seen clearly from the ground often vanished completely from the air. Weather made the problem worse. Cloud layers hid entire regions. Smoke from earlier fighting blurred landmarks. Rivers, roads, and rail lines, essential for navigation, were obscured or misidentified. Pilots often flew toward estimated positions rather than confirmed locations. Even when an army was located, accuracy remained a critical limitation. Bombers operated at high altitude to avoid ground fire. From those heights, bombing became an exercise in probability rather than precision. Wind pushed falling bombs sideways. Small navigation errors multiplied over distance. Aircraft released weapons seconds apart, spreading impacts across wide areas. Aiming at a moving target under these conditions bordered on impossible. There was a trade-off planners could not escape. Flying lower improved accuracy, but dramatically increased losses. Flying higher protected crews, but scattered bombs far from their aim. There was no altitude where air power could be both survivable and precise. Early campaigns made this painfully clear. Aircraft returned reporting successful attacks, judged by explosions and smoke. Reconnaissance conducted later often revealed limited damage to enemy formations. Ground commanders reported that units were delayed, but rarely destroyed. Losses told a different story. Crews were killed. Aircraft were lost. Replacement rates struggled to keep pace. Air power was consuming resources faster than it was delivering battlefield results. Inside planning rooms, frustration grew. Bombers were too valuable to waste. Crews were too scarce to expend without effect. And armies, adaptable and mobile, refused to present themselves as stable targets. Gradually, a conclusion took shape. Air power was poorly suited for hunting moving forces, but it was exceptionally suited for striking things that could not move. And once that realization took hold, attention shifted away from the battlefield itself and toward the fixed systems that allowed armies to exist at all. Inside planning rooms far from the front, maps stayed pinned to walls long after meetings ended. Markers showed troop movements that had already changed. Reports arrived late, often contradicting one another. Reconnaissance photographs were studied, annotated, debated, then quietly set aside when new information arrived. Planners faced a narrowing set of options. Bombers could be sent after armies again, accepting low accuracy and high losses. Or they could be redirected toward targets that remained fixed, visible, and measurable. Neither choice was clean. Hitting field forces aligned with traditional ideas of warfare, but results had been limited. Losses were mounting, and decisive outcomes remained elusive. Shifting focus meant redefining what counted as a military target. Factories produced weapons, but also employed civilians. Rail yards moved divisions, but also served cities. Power stations fed industry, but also homes. Every option carried consequences beyond the battlefield. Yet industrial war left little room for ideal solutions. Armies no longer fought alone. They were sustained by vast networks stretching deep into national territory. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacements flowed continuously from urban centers to the front. If those flows could be disrupted, armies would slow even if they were never directly engaged. This logic did not emerge as a single decision. It formed gradually, shaped by failed missions, loss reports, and production statistics. Each campaign added data. Each setback narrowed alternatives. By the time the shift was openly discussed, it already felt inevitable. The question was no longer whether air power should be used against cities. It was whether ignoring those systems made any strategic sense at all. And once planners accepted that modern armies were only the visible edge of a much larger machine, the focus of the air war changed with them. Once attention shifted away from armies, planners began looking at the war from a different height. Not from the level of divisions and battalions, but from the level of systems. Modern war was no longer decided solely by what happened at the front. It depended on how quickly weapons could be produced, repaired, transported, and replaced. That process unfolded far behind the fighting. Inside cities, factories were only one part of that structure. They relied on electricity generated at power stations. Power stations depended on steady fuel deliveries. Fuel arrived by rail and port. Rail networks required maintenance crews, signaling systems, and uninterrupted schedules. Each layer supported the next. If one failed, strains spread through the entire network. From the air, these connections became visible in ways they never had from the ground. Rail yards revealed the rhythm of supply. Industrial districts showed patterns of production. Power plants and refineries stood out as fixed points essential to continuous output. Cities condensed these elements into compact, identifiable targets. They were not chosen for what they represented symbolically. They were chosen for how much they contained. Labor became part of the calculation as well. Industrial output depended on workers arriving on time, rested enough to perform repetitive, demanding tasks. Housing shortages, transportation disruptions, and repeated alarms all interfered with that rhythm. Planners did not need civilians to stop working entirely. They only needed production to slow. A missed shift, a delayed train, a damaged substation. None of these outcomes required destroying every factory. They required sustained disruption. This thinking reshaped targeting priorities. Instead of individual buildings, entire districts were selected. Instead of single strikes, campaigns were planned over weeks. Instead of precision, reliability became the goal. Area bombing doctrine emerged from this reality. If accuracy could not be guaranteed, saturation could. Bombs falling across industrial zones, rail corridors, and worker housing were expected to create cumulative effects that no single strike could achieve alone. The objective was no longer to defeat the enemy soldier directly. It was to weaken the system that equipped, moved, and replaced him. Once cities were understood this way, not as population centers, but as engines of war, the logic of targeting them became increasingly difficult for planners to ignore. The battlefield had expanded again, this time into the infrastructure that made fighting possible at all. Once attention shifted away from armies, planners began looking at the war from a different height. Not from the level of divisions and battalions, but from the level of systems. Modern war was no longer decided solely by what happened at the front. It depended on how quickly weapons could be produced, repaired, transported, and replaced. That process unfolded far behind the fighting. Inside cities, factories were only one part of that structure. They relied on electricity generated at power stations. Power stations depended on steady fuel deliveries. Fuel arrived by rail and port. Rail networks required maintenance crews, signaling systems, and uninterrupted schedules. Each layer supported the next. If one failed, strain spread through the entire network. From the air, these connections became visible in ways they never had from the ground. Rail yards revealed the rhythm of supply. Industrial districts showed patterns of production. Power plants and refineries stood out as fixed points essential to continuous output. Cities condensed these elements into compact, identifiable targets. They were not chosen for what they represented symbolically. They were chosen for how much they contained. Labor became part of the calculation as well. Industrial output depended on workers arriving on time, rested enough to perform repetitive, demanding tasks. Housing shortages, transportation disruptions, and repeated alarms all interfered with that rhythm. Planners did not need civilians to stop working entirely. They only needed production to slow. A missed shift, a delayed train, a damaged substation. None of these outcomes required destroying every factory. They required sustained disruption. This thinking reshaped targeting priorities. Instead of individual buildings, entire districts were selected. Instead of single strikes, campaigns were planned over weeks. Instead of precision, reliability became the goal. Area bombing doctrine emerged from this reality. If accuracy could not be guaranteed, saturation could. Bombs falling across industrial zones, rail corridors, and worker housing were expected to create cumulative effects that no single strike could achieve alone. The objective was no longer to defeat the enemy soldier directly. It was to weaken the system that equipped, moved, and replaced him. Once cities were understood this way, not as population centers, but as engines of war, the logic of targeting them became increasingly difficult for planners to ignore. The battlefield had expanded again, this time into the infrastructure that made fighting possible at all. Decisions were made far from the effects. Targets were identified by coordinates, not names. Cities became entries on schedules rather than places where people lived. This was not a shift in emotion. It was a shift in scale. Industrial war required abstraction to function. The larger the system, the less room there was for individual consideration. By the later stages of the conflict, bombing cities was no longer framed as escalation. It was routine. Not because it was simple, but because it fit the logic that now governed how the war was fought. When the war ended, the air campaigns left behind no single conclusion. Cities lay damaged or destroyed. Industrial output had collapsed in some regions and adapted in others. Transportation networks were fractured, repaired, rerouted. Civilian casualties were counted, but their meaning resisted simple interpretation. One question dominated post-war analysis. Did bombing cities shorten the war? Studies produced conflicting answers. In some cases, sustained attacks reduced output and forced resources away from the front. In others, production recovered faster than expected. Factories relocated, labor reorganized, systems adapted under pressure. What bombing achieved was uneven and often temporary. What it changed permanently was how war itself was understood. The distinction between battlefield and home had been erased. Industrial societies could no longer isolate fighting from daily life. Power grids, transport systems, and population centers were now inseparable from national defense. That lesson did not disappear with peace. Cold War strategy absorbed it. Deterrence theory assumed cities as leverage points. Nuclear doctrine compressed the logic of industrial bombing into moments instead of months. International law attempted to restore boundaries. Rules were written to protect civilians and limit targeting. But those efforts existed in tension with a reality already proven. The air war had shown what modern conflict could reach. Cities were not targeted simply out of cruelty. They were targeted because industrial war made them unavoidable. And once the boundary between soldier and society was crossed, it could never be fully rebuilt.